Professor Patton is here because in a couple of days there will be a big Derrida conference at the Colegio de San Lorenzo. And he's one of the keynote speakers there, together with Beatrice Spivak, translator of dermatology of Derrida, and a couple of colleagues from the Ateneo de Manila also. But we are very lucky today to have him. He just flew in from Sydney yesterday, and we're going to have him first, and that's a good thing, at least for us. And so therefore, I'd like to thank Professor Patton for agreeing to visit us here at the University of Santo Tomas. So, welcome and thank you for being here. I'm going to ask Mr. Rainiel Reyes to introduce our resource speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Paul Patton is Scientia Professor at the University of New South Wales, where he transferred from the University of Sydney in 2002. After secondary school in Sydney, he studied at the University of Sydney and the University of Paris. He has published widely on aspects of French post-structuralist philosophy, Nietzsche, and contemporary political philosophy. He translated Deleuze's Difference and Repetition, as well as work by Foucault, Nancy, and Baudrillard. He has written extensively on indigenous rights and issues related to historical injustice. A focus of his current work is to bring together French post-structuralist and liberal normative approaches to political philosophy. So again, we're very lucky to have Professor Patton to deliver a paper before us. So, sir, you want the floor to...
Thank you very much for the warm introduction and welcome, and for the invitation to speak here at University of Santo Tomas. It's my first time in Manila, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak here. I do have a student in Sydney who comes from this university who will be here later in the week, but unfortunately couldn't make it in time for today's talk. So what I would like to talk about is Derrida and political philosophy, or Derrida and politics. And what I have prepared is a wide-ranging talk that looks at the development of Derrida's engagement with questions of politics, and to try and say a little bit about some of the ways in which he tried to bring together his distinctive approach to philosophy, his deconstructive approach, and questions of politics, analysis of particular political concepts. So I apologize for the wide-ranging and somewhat sketchy nature of the talk, but I hope it might be helpful, and I'm happy to stop if people want to ask questions, and certainly to take up some of the issues in discussion. So I start with this question about which much was written for a long time. What were the politics of deconstruction? And this was a question that accompanied Derrida's work from quite early on, from the publication of grammatology and other works in the late 1960s, those 3 volumes that he published in 1967. And in France, he was often asked this question, what's the political import of deconstruction as a way of doing philosophy? And in one response to an interview published in the little volume Positions, an interview in 1971, he responded by saying that deconstruction is not neutral, he says, it intervenes. But it's still true that for much of the first 2 decades, the 1960s and 1970s of his publication, the period of his publications, Derrida did not write about politics or about political concepts. So if his work intervened, it was largely in philosophical debates. intervening on the side of difference against identity, in favour of openness against the closure of structural systems. It intervened against dogmatism in whatever field by exposing in the ways that he did the limits of attempts to provide secure metaphysical foundations, or what the American philosopher Richard Rorty calls final vocabularies. So for Derrida, the movement of différance and the permanent possibility of citation or iteration served to ensure the possibility of reinterpretation and transformation within all established institutions of thought and society. So, and he always endorsed the view that many philosophers, many of his contemporary French philosophers shared the view that philosophy is by nature a form of political activity. But in this discussion, this questioning about the politics of deconstruction, many critics on both the left and the right argued that Derrida's deconstruction was nothing more than a form of nihilism, of obscurantism, or in some cases irrationalism, that served and could serve no useful political purpose. So his views on différance, the undecidability of some of the conceptual figures that he developed in his readings of Plato, Saussure and others, notions like the pharmakon, the mark or the trace in his philosophy of language, these concepts were widely supposed to lead to a kind of indecision. So undecidability in his terms was taken to mean inability to decide, or a refusal to take sides, or a simple decisionism that rendered political judgment arbitrary. An American critic, Richard Wolin, summarizes this kind of criticism in the following terms. He says, quoting Wolin, "Since deconstruction qua political discourse seems to privilege the negative moments of destabilization and dismantling, how might it counter the suspicion that it remains incapable, constitutionally incapable, of fostering political stability, political solidarity, or the democratic ideal of politics as an equitable and just framework for realizing collective goals and projects?" So, and that's just one representative comment of many such remarks that were made, critical remarks, about Derrida's early deconstructive work. So Derrida's own reluctance to engage with political issues and political concepts only began to evaporate toward the end of the 1970s. So he gave a lecture in the United States at the University of Virginia in 1976 that was subsequently published under the title Declarations of Independence, in which he offers in part a commentary on the United States Declaration of Independence, but a commentary that he presented as an experimental application to this exemplary political document of concepts and questions, as he said, that have been developed elsewhere on an apparently less political corpus. So the kinds of works that he analysed in grammatology, for example, the theory of linguistics of Saussure, the anthropology of Levi-Strauss, the writings of Rousseau, among others. Following this lecture in 1976, there were a whole series of texts that he published during the 1980s that show the evolution of his efforts to address political concepts. And they culminate in a conference paper at the end of that decade, Force of Law, that was given at a conference in 1989 and subsequently published in a journal in 1990, where he asserted that the very idea of justice, and he contrasts justice with law, the very idea of justice, he says, is bound up with the possibility of deconstruction. And I'll come back to say a little bit more about that assertion and what lies behind it. But just to elaborate on some of the other works that he published in this decade, in the 1980s, a couple of works that dealt with the question of racism and apartheid in South Africa. One called Racism's Last Word, which was initially a catalogue essay for an exhibition entitled Artists of the World Against Apartheid, that was published in 1983. And then an essay called The Laws of Reflection, Nelson Mandela in Admiration, that was first published in French in 1986 and subsequently translated in 1987. So these and other texts, some others like it, what I mean in saying there was an evolution of political engagement and essays that address political concepts in the 1980s. And I mentioned this conference paper, Force of Law, at the end of the decade. And following that, from the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, his work increasingly took up political concepts and developed sometimes quite detailed analyses of ethical and political concepts that include particularly the notion of hospitality, about which he wrote a number of essays, the concept of forgiveness, which he discussed and related to forms of political forgiveness, the kinds of political process of reconciliation, like the one that took place in South Africa after the end of apartheid. He wrote an essay, published a book called Politics of Friendship, which looks at the relationship in the history of philosophy between ideas of friendship, equality, and democracy, beginning with Aristotle's establishment of a link between political citizenship and friendship, which Aristotle famously described as a kind of civic friendship. He also wrote essays about Europe as a political project, about the ideals of the Enlightenment, and in his later work about the prospects for a cosmopolitan global political order and the future of states. So these are some of the essay topics that he wrote about in the 1980s and 1990s. He also increasingly in that period became engaged in political activities. I've mentioned his engagement with the question of apartheid. He spoke out in defense of imprisoned intellectuals and writers, and took increasingly forceful public positions on questions like the treatment of illegal immigrants, which was one of the issues that he discussed in connection with the concept of hospitality. The politics of reconciliation that I've mentioned, other things like the death penalty, and then the question that is the topic or the title of the last essays published before his death, a little volume called, in English, Rogues, in which he talks about the behavior of so-called rogue states. And I mentioned the important, one of his important political books, The Politics of Friendship, but the other is the book published in 1993, Spectres of Marx, which he published at a time after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of Eastern European interview. And one of the things he suggested is that there was a certain air of intellectual intimidation that made it very difficult for him to raise deconstructive questions about Marx and Marxism, because to do so would have been seen to put him on the side of critics. So it wasn't until the publication of Spectres of Marx, much later, 1993, that he devoted an entire essay to the legacy of Marxism. And this essay, Spectres of Marx, remained faithful in some ways to his earlier philosophical reticence by pursuing a deconstructive analysis of Marx's own ambivalent relation to the theme of spectrality or haunting that haunts his writing, Marx's own writing. And indeed, Derrida maintained a deconstructive skepticism with regard to a number of the fundamental concepts of Marx's philosophy of history, like labour, the concepts of mode of production, and indeed of social class. And in full awareness of the very checkered history that Marxism inspired, and very much conscious of the contradiction of the injunction to remain faithful to the heritage of a revolutionary tradition, Derrida still insisted that his primary concern was to reiterate his long-standing commitment to a principle, as he put it, of radical and interminable critique that can also be found in Marx. So he says at one point in Spectres of Marx, that deconstruction, as he practiced it, would have been impossible and unthinkable in a pre-Marxist space. Deconstruction, he said, has never had any sense or interest, in my view at least, except as a radicalization, which is to say also in the tradition of a certain Marxism, in a certain spirit of Marxism. So there's no doubt a lot more to say about that book and about Derrida's relation to Marx, but what I want to move on to is some of the later work. Derrida often insisted, as I mentioned, that there had always been a moral and political dimension to his work. He denied that there was any political or ethical turn in his work in the 1980s. But on other occasions, he recognized that it was, as he put it, too easy to say that deconstruction had always been a political enterprise. And in this interview, which is the Politics and Friendship interview that I mentioned earlier with Michael Sprinker, the American academic, he went on to suggest that an articulation, a more direct articulation between deconstruction and politics, must imply, as he says, a radical re-elaboration of the concept of politics in general circulation. And by re-elaboration of accepted ways of understanding politics, he doesn't mean the invention of a wholly new concept, but rather, as he put it, the reworking of existing concepts or as unjust and in need of reform. So in these terms, for example, he suggests that we can inspire new forms of law, new forms of hospitality, or new forms of forgiveness by reference to the paradoxical idea of the unforgivable, or the idea of unconditional hospitality that underpins the possibility of improvement or progress in the existing conditional forms of welcome extended to foreigners. So he says in one of these essays, and again I apologize for the length of this quote, this is the essay called On Cosmopolitanism and Forgiveness. He says, it's a question of knowing how to transform and improve the law, and of knowing if this improvement is possible within an historical space which takes place between the law of an unconditional hospitality, offered a priori to every other, to all newcomers, whoever they may be, and on the other hand, the conditional laws of a right to hospitality, without which this unconditional law of hospitality would be in danger of remaining a pious and irresponsible desire, without form, without potency, and so on. So he asserts, a reciprocal relationship between the unconditional, the idea of an unconditional hospitality, and its conditional forms. But again, asserts that it's by reference to the unconditional that we can criticize, transform, and improve the existing conditional forms. So, and indeed, whenever the question of the politics or the purpose of deconstruction is raised, Derrida points to the undesirability, as he puts it, of having a good conscience about established ways of acting and thinking. He points to the desirability of being willing to question and challenge what is currently accepted as self-evident in our ways of thinking and acting, while at the same time refusing to specify how we should think or act differently. So in Spectres of Marx, again, he describes this as a form of critique that, as he puts it, belongs to the movement of an experience open to the absolute future of what is coming. In this respect, his deconstructive analyses of political concepts resemble the kind of open-ended critical strategy that we find in other French thinkers of contemporaries like Foucault, but also Deleuze and Guattari. Like them, Derrida wants to provide reasons for thinking that criticism of the present is not only possible but desirable, but in a way that doesn't rely on some implicit teleology or some utopian vision of the future. Formulating these different figures of the unconditioned or the undeconstructible, as he sometimes calls them, is one way to insist on the relation to an open but non-teleological future. So if I can strain your patience for just a little bit longer, I'll just say a little bit more about this idea of democracy to come that Derrida develops in some of those later essays. So, in particular, the interview in the Philosophy in a Time of Terror volume called Autoimmunity, Real and Symbolic Suicides, and the two essays published in Rogues, the last book published before his death. These writings provide some of the most detailed accounts of what Derrida considers to be the most important questions in contemporary political philosophy, namely the nature of democracy in domestic as well as in the international arena, and its connection with both the sovereignty of the responsible individual and the sovereignty of states, state sovereignty. And in these essays, again, he pursues that dual strategy that I pointed to of investigating the history of the concept of democracy and drawing a distinction between its past and present forms and its potential future. He draws a distinction between actual democracies and what he calls a democracy to come, that shares many of the characteristics of that distinction that I've just tried to demonstrate between conditioned and unconditioned concepts of hospitality, forgiveness, and so on. So his excursions into the history of philosophical characterizations of democracy from Plato and Aristotle to Rousseau and Tocqueville, among others, serve to highlight the complex and contradictory character of the concept that we have inherited from this tradition. And then toward the end of the longest essay in Rogues, the essay called The Reason of the Strongest, Are There Rogue States?, he revisits some of the contexts in which he has employed this term democracy to come in order to try to clarify what he means by this paradoxical, aporetic concept. He points out, firstly, that democracy to come doesn't refer to a determinate future form of democracy. Why? Well, one reason he gives is the to come in this phrase does not refer to a future that will one day become present, but to a kind of structural future that will never be actualized in any present. So rather than a future present, it refers to the absolute future of pure invention, the unforeseeable and wholly other. And it's worth pointing out here that this term, democracy to come, plays on the French word for the future. The future in French is avenir. L'avenir is the French word for the future, which literally means the to come, to break it up, the preposition à venir, the to come, the future. And Derrida's idea then is of a democracy to come that remains perpetually and always to come. So it's not something which is in principle possible, but simply deferred, but something that, like invention, properly so called, is of the order of the impossible. So it's not a regulative idea in the Kantian sense, or indeed in the common senses of that term. Nor does it regulate, he says, in providing a rule to be followed or a single consistent set of norms to be followed. And this is partly because, as he points out, the history of the concept of democracy contains a number of strands of principles in tension, in contradiction with each other. But secondly, and for this reason, this is the second reason, that democracy to come doesn't refer to a determinate form of democracy because of the complexity of the process by which we derive our contemporary concepts of democracy from the historical tradition. We inherit these ideas, he says, ideas of democracy from that tradition, but in a manner that is always selective and that involves rejecting as well as endorsing aspects of the past. Because the history of democratic thought is already driven by a series of tensions and contradictions, it's not surprising that the possible futures of democracy should also lead to paradox. The contradictory demands at the heart of that tradition include the tension between the sovereign power or force of the people and the absence of force signified by the rule of law. This points to the aporia between force and law that Derrida discussed at length in the essay, Force of Law. But there are other tensions, like the one I mentioned, between the incalculable singularity of the individual and the calculable or exchangeable quality of all citizens as equal qua citizens. There is the tension between democracy's commitment to inclusivity and to exclusivity. So it wants to include as participants all citizens, but it also wants to set boundaries to distinguish between who is or who can be a citizen and who cannot. This latter tension again emerges in some of the contemporary polemics around migration. It emerges in political arguments over who are the people who make up the sovereign and what are the conditions by which membership of that people is determined. Derrida says at one point in Rogues, one will never be able to prove that there is more democracy in granting or refusing the right to vote to immigrants. In other words, there are arguments on both sides. And finally, there is the aporia that in its specific form depends on the place of freedom in a democracy. He asks, must a democracy leave free and in position to exercise power those who risk mounting an assault on democratic freedoms? Well-known paradox in democratic theory. So a democratic state might either allow enemies of democracy to seize power by democratic means, or alternatively, it might seek to prevent this by interrupting or suspending democratic procedures. Either way, Derrida says, the outcome is dangerous for democracy. And in its general form, he says, this aporia amounts to the susceptibility of democracy to the logic of autoimmunity, by which he means the body's suppression of the very immune systems which protect it against internal or external threats. So the suppression, the lifting the exceptions to rule of law, which might be sometimes invoked in order to combat enemies of democracy, would be instances of this autoimmunity, as Derrida discusses it. So the suspension of democratic procedures or the suspension of civil liberties to protect the freedom of citizens are examples of this logic of autoimmunity in the political sphere. And in addition to these negative determinations of the concept, there's a number of ways in which he wants to say this concept of democracy to come can be defined positively, and I'll end with these. Firstly, the manner in which, like a promise already uttered in the past, democracy to come intervenes in or structures the action of agents in the present by reference to some future event. In this sense, as he suggests in a couple of places in Rogues, democracy to come must have the structure of a promise, and thus the memory of that which carries the future, the to come, here and now. So again, he's alluding to the way in which this idea of a possible future form of democracy can itself intervene in the present. It could be less restrictive, it could involve more equality, and so on. And as the reference to the here and now suggests, the concept of democracy to come is supposed to play an immediate and active role in the present. It calls for, as he says, an interminable political critique. So in this sense, he wants to say, he's alluding back to some of his earlier work on Austin, the phrase democracy to come is not simply constitutive, as J.L. Austin said, but performative. It functions both as an open-ended description and as an imperative or a demand for more democracy. So here, in this essay in Rogues, as in Spectres of Marx and Politics of Friendship, democracy to come is linked to justice as opposed to law, in the sense that justice orients the improvement of the law. And in turn, as in the case of the appeal to those unconditioned concepts of hospitality, forgiveness, and gift, the concept of democracy to come opens up a space for the renegotiation or reconfiguration of present determined forms of democracy. So in this manner, Derrida relies on this concept of democracy to come, as he puts it, to provide a reason to think that existing democracies, or so-called democracies, remain inadequate to the democratic demand. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Patton. Before we begin with our Q&A, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of our Dean Michael Anthony Vasco for joining us. So we're about to begin the question and answer portion. So if you have any questions you'd like to raise, kindly step up to the mic, kindly state your name and your institutional affiliation. So, yes. Email.
Good afternoon, Sir Paul Patton. These are my questions, or I'm just asking here for clarifications. It's really inevitable for me to understand your paper in relation to Deleuze's philosophy, specifically his concept of schizoanalysis.
Right.
Yeah. First question is, what do you think is the role of desire in the concept or process of deconstruction? At least in schizoanalysis, we try to liberate desire from being idealized towards a certain condition of pure becoming or creativity. So is there a place of concept of desire in Derrida's notion of deconstruction?
A good question and a difficult question. Derrida does talk about and has written a lot about psychoanalysis. So he takes the question of desire quite seriously, but not in a political way. I guess the philosopher do. I haven't said anything. I'm not sure what to say offhand about what he would say, what he thinks about the role of desire or the place of desire in politics. No, I don't think I can offer a direct answer there, other than to say that for Derrida's engagement with politics, as I've been talking about, is not of the same kind. It's not a politics of desire in the way that Deleuze-Guattari's schizoanalysis is. It is a more direct engagement with specific political, philosophical, or ethical concepts like hospitality, like law and justice, like democracy. So, and he doesn't, for the most part, in discussing those, does not introduce the notion of desire and doesn't relate those to questions of the unconscious. He does in other essays, for example, about mourning, the work of mourning, the nature of mourning. He writes explicitly and uses psychoanalysis, but no, I don't have an easy answer to the question of how he would relate a psychoanalytic understanding of the subject. Well, actually, that's probably part of the answer. His way of relating the question of desire to politics would be in terms of a more traditionally psychoanalytic way of understanding the subject, the political subject, as a subject of desire, not only a citizen of the
Last question. Even though for Derrida, the democracy to come is a pure event, which I guess would involve the people to come, term present in Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy. I can't help but think of the question, can you consider the Syrian refugees or the migrants as the people to come, that in a way are the people who will work for this democracy to come? I don't think that question makes sense.
Again, yeah, it's a good question and a very difficult question. I mean, I think it is hard to tie these Derridean concepts of the unconditional to particular historical examples and historical figures. So rather than talking about a particular people or a particular movement of people as illustrations or exemplifications of the people to come, I think for Derrida it would be more helpful to think about our responses to such movements in terms of such concepts. So in the case of hospitality, what he does explicitly is to raise questions about the way in which France in the 1980s, but one could do so in relation to Western Europe today, the way in which it responds or has responded to immigrants from Syria and elsewhere in North Africa. And there is, it is a very conflicted and conflictual political process of, on the one hand, wanting to extend welcome, but on the other hand, confronting a real hostility and a resistance to hospitality on the part of some. So what Derrida provides is, I guess, a conceptual framework in which one can raise questions about the limitations of existing conditional forms. And the same about forms of democracy, but again, that is not the same as identifying any particular group or any particular people as exemplifying this democracy to come. We can certainly use the concept to talk about less undemocratic ways of governing, about more democratic forms of society, let's say, those that extend the franchise or those that try to maintain a balance between men and women in the political process in ways that has not been the case in most European democracies, even though they're formally committed to it, and so on. So it's in those terms, I think, that we can talk about movement toward a people to come, perhaps, but not so much identifying particular people as that.
Okay, floor is open. Questions? Yes, so please.
Good afternoon, Dr. Patton. I'm Franz. I am intrigued. I've been intrigued with Derrida's notion of undecidability.
Right.
So I hope you can still further elaborate on it and maybe give some applicability, especially for decision makers and policy makers.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Again, it's a good question. I just touched on that notion of undecidability, and it's a troubling one in Derrida's work. And I mentioned right at the beginning the comment by Richard Wallen, which is a common reaction that people take Derrida's notion of undecidability to mean something like indecision or inability to decide. Derrida means something quite different by it, and in his later attempts to elaborate, he often talks about what he calls the experience of undecidability, and the way in which he cashes that out is in terms of what he calls the aporia, the contradiction, the paradox at the heart of the very notion of decision. And it's a familiar one in philosophy. So he says, on the one hand, to make a decision, you have to be informed. You need to know the relevant principles of a policy. You need to know the facts of the situation. If you're a judge, let's say, but there also has to be an end to that. There has to be a decision, a cut, he says. And it's one political community that is a power necessarily endowed with force. So, as he says, I want to talk about very origin, humanity, and human being in general. In fact,